I'm Todd Herrincole, a faculty member here in the UW School of Social Work, and it's my role and pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. I'd like to start by giving a special thanks to Joan and the folks at Committee for Children for organizing the event here tonight, and of course to our distinguished panelists for joining us and taking their time to talk with us about their areas of expertise. Joan asked that I just say a few words about my own area of research or areas of research as it relates to the conversation tonight, so I'll just make a few comments about that. So like David Finkelhor and others, I have been for a number of years studying the etiology and consequences of child maltreatment. And that work that we have done over the years has clearly shown that the effects of sexual abuse over an individual's lifetime, along with other forms of abuse, can be devastating, to make it clear, and that at times the effects can be life-altering for individuals. I have also been involved, very actively involved in trying to translate information from basic research into actionable steps for prevention and intervention programs. And most recently, have been working alongside my wife in the College of Education and her colleagues on a new initiative to increase awareness of social-emotional learning and its importance in formal schooling. So we engaged in this partnership with the College of Ed because we realized that despite schools and community-based organizations that partner with schools as being primary sites for prevention initiatives, rarely do they attend holistically to the needs of children. And so we sort of engaged in this partnership with the idea of changing that. So I'm particularly excited about the panel here tonight because the presenters cover a range of interrelated issues, some of which I also work within. And each of them has devoted their career to translating findings into real-world kinds of action. And that, for me, is the most important thing that we as scholars, as researchers, can do. So in ending, I would just like to thank again Joan for organizing the event, or allowing us to help organize the event here tonight, and to extend a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Deborah Boyer. I'm a cultural anthropologist and also a co-founder of Committee for Children, one of the sponsors of this event this evening. I've been given the opportunity to talk about the beginnings of Committee for Children because it is a great example of applying research findings to social problems as well as investing in research for quality practice. Committee for Children had a very interesting beginning, and people are often very surprised by its beginning, so I will share this with you, which is kind of evolved into a myth over time, but nevertheless an interesting myth. Committee for Children began in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences here at the University of Washington with Dr. Jennifer James, also a cultural anthropologist, who was doing research on female criminality and prostitution. And I do say prostitution. I know many of you are using the word trafficking now, but I use the word prostitution to make it clear what happens to women's bodies. In about 1979, yes, I'm still walking, 1979, and Kip also, many of us. It's children of the 60s, keep going. Okay. I want to get serious again here. In 1979, we began a series of studies on adolescents, both young men and young women, who were involved in prostitution. And based on the ethnographic research that Dr. James had done previously with adult women involved in prostitution, we asked a question in the adolescent studies that had not been asked before. And that question to these young women and young men on the street was, what is your sexual history? That question had not been asked before. The literature would lead you to believe that prostitutes were the cause of prostitution. Many of you are aware of what we found. We found a very high prevalence of childhood sexual abuse. It happened early, it happened repeatedly, often there were multiple offenders, often with violence. It happened to young men, it happened to young women. The molested 4-year-old became the raped 11-year-old and the prostituted 13-year-old. Now, I know that it is not the only factor, but it is an important one, and we began to understand how this made young people vulnerable to prostitution, vulnerable to the coercion of exploiters and pimps, and obedient to customers. Then we ask another question. What do we do with this knowledge? Otherwise, why should we probe these lives? We quickly focused on the whole child abuse issue and child abuse prevention, engaged with the research community, and we learned of a person in Minnesota, Cordelia Anderson, with the Illusion Theater in Minnesota, who had a puppet show, Red Light, Green Light, and taught child safety skills. And we brought her out here and learned all we could from her. And I'm not sure exactly in about 1981 or 82, nobody really knows when. It's kind of like the signing of the Declaration of Independence, nobody knows exactly what day it happened. But somewhere in there, I'm not sure what came upon us, but we decided that we should get a child abuse prevention curriculum in the schools and in all the schools, and if possible, around the world. We were truly children of the 60s. We felt that this was a very important piece of the whole child abuse movement, prevention movement, that had not been addressed. And so with $6,000 from Edna Goodrich, from the King County Juvenile Court, a small group began to write the first Committee for Children curriculum talking about touching. And we went to the best research to look at content, to look at technique, and we also moved forward with forming the organization Committee for Children. Our intention was to get to children early and to tell them what they had not been told before we saw them on the street. Along with the safety and refusal skills, we wanted children to know that many of us knew that these kinds of things happened, that it was wrong, that it was not their fault, that there was someone that they could tell. They would be believed, we would help stop it, and that those events did not determine the kind of woman or the kind of man that they would ultimately become. Then Committee for Children took the next step, the second step, and many of you may be familiar with the second step curriculum. With the second step, our intent was to intervene and stop the creation of victimizers. Now, the context is very different now, but that was the original intent. And once again, we went to the research community, and the focus was on empathy and developing empathy. The theoretical field of social emotional learning was not in our vocabulary, but that's the way all of this works. We went from practice to research and research to practice, and the contribution has gone full circle. So this evening, for Committee for Children, it reflects our ongoing commitment to the prevention of child abuse and a reminder of our first commitment, and that is for safe children, and our interdependence on research to evaluate what we do so we can do it better and to learn what else we can do to keep children safe. Now, there are many, many people, and many of them in this room, who have made huge contributions to the success of Committee for Children. We're in 25,000 school districts and have presence in 26 countries. And one of the people who I'd like to introduce now, who has made a significant contribution and continues to do so, is Committee for Children's Executive Director, Joan Duffel. Joan began her career teaching kindergarten to abused children in a treatment setting, and now she's an internationally recognized expert in child abuse prevention and social emotional learning. And she has been with Committee for Children longer than either one of us would like to count. So I would like to Please welcome Joan Duffel.
Thanks, everybody. Can you hear me? Oh, good. What a great story. I never get tired of that story. It's just, it's a really inspiring to me to think about where we've come. But I also want to say, though Committee for Children has been the organizer of this event tonight, I really want to start by recognizing all of you in the room. Many of you have been doing yeoman's work in this area of preventing sexual abuse of kids for as long or longer than we have. And so I don't ever want you to be at an event like this and think that we just thought this idea up yesterday. You know, all of us have been doing this work for many, many years, and there are some of you in the room who are really the true visionaries that have really moved this work forward, including our incredible panelists tonight. So I just want to start by saying that. I want to also just call out the fact that there is going to be a reception, a networking reception after this, and I don't want you to forget that, because part of the reason for pulling us all together from all these different disciplines that we represent is that we can't, any of us, do this work alone. We all need each other. So I really want as many people as can to stay for some refreshments and some food and just some networking time so that we can really spend time together and rekindle some relationships. I want to thank very much the University of Washington for hosting this. We might have convened it, but frankly, if they hadn't done kind of all the legwork to, you know, get everything together for this, I mean, it's been a fantastic partnership, and we greatly appreciate all of your help and support in getting this together. It's been a win-win, I think. I want to thank our panelists for sure for being here, and for really, they spent the day with us at Committee for Children. We had a think tank today, so I hope we didn't burn them out. We were really spending time diving into the research to look at our own practice and see how we can make improvements to it. And we're just thrilled to be able to share them with all of you. I want to thank Kip Takuda, because Kip is our moderator tonight, and I'm going to be introducing him in a minute, but he's really the right choice. He's been in this work for so long, and he's also a lot of fun to work with. And sponsors, we have the School of Social Work, as I mentioned, at the UW, the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office, the Children's Justice Center, Bobby Bridges' outfit, King County Sexual Assault Resource Center, Mary Ellen and Lindsay are here, and maybe more people, Casey Family Programs, Seattle Children's. Carol, thank you for being here. Archdiocese of Seattle, Shauna McMahon is here from the Archdiocese Safe Environment Office. UW, the Harborview Center for Sexual and Traumatic Stress. Lucy Berliner could not be here tonight. She was very sad not to be here, but she sends us all her best wishes. And finally, I want to recognize our funder who helped us put this on, who really supported this whole event tonight, and some additional work we're going to be doing in this area, the Rainier Institute and Foundation. They have been a terrific supporter of our other work in bullying prevention research, and now this work as well, so we couldn't be doing that without them. So I have a couple of other announcements I'm supposed to make. One is, did somebody lose their keys? Did you think you had your keys but you don't have them? Can we lift them up? It's a Nissan key fob with a single key. Yeah, you might not know till you leave, but if you drive a Nissan, you might want to pay attention. And it could also belong to the people next door. They tend to be forgetful. Also, I want to remind everybody that if you're looking for CEUs are available from the School of Social Work. So after the event, please see Anjali. Do you want to wave and say hi, Anjali, afterwards if you want? Yeah. Finally, I want to recognize some of the elected officials that are in the room. I think Representative Tomiko Santos is here. Is she here? Thank you very much for being here. Senator Jeannie Cole Wells. Jeannie, thank you for being here. And Mary Helen Roberts, Representative Roberts. Great, terrific, thank you. So I really want to just give them a round of applause for their service to our state. And really, thank you for coming out, particularly at a very busy time in your lives, to be informed and hopefully inspired and to rekindle some passion in our state around this work. So without further ado, I am going to introduce our moderator, Kip Takuda. Kip, many of you know, probably most of you in the room know Kip. It's hard not to know him because he's a pretty great guy to know. And Kip has been a longtime child advocate in Washington State. He was one of the first, I guess the second director of the Washington Council for the Prevention of Child Abuse. He also was a longtime state legislator and a champion for children's issues for many, many years here in our state, and still is. So thank you, Kip. I really appreciate the fact that you're doing this moderation tonight. I wish you luck because these people really like to talk. So thank you.
Thank you, Joan.
You want this?
Thank you so much. I think I'll switch here in a minute. But good evening, everybody. Thank you for that. Thank you, Joan. Thank you to the Committee for Children. I'm honored to be here this evening, you know, this is going to, you're going to get as excited as I am in a minute. I just know in hearing these panelists. But these, our three panelists are perhaps the most, certainly three of the most learned scholars in the country, if not in the world, on the topic of child sexual abuse. And we are extremely lucky to have them here. I'm just, thank you for asking me to be here today. You know, I'm the facilitator, and by the time I'm through here, I hope to accomplish a couple of objectives. You know, one, by the time I get through here, I hope you know why you're here. It's the first thing. The second objective is one that I know that we're going to accomplish, and that is after hearing our three learned scholars, I know that all of us, even including myself, are going to have a much greater understanding of what the state of the discipline is. I have no doubt. And the third objective that I hope we accomplish this evening, by the time this is all over with, is that you will, or a great many of you will have agreed to maybe take this or participate in an effort to expand our prevention efforts. Those are the three. They're very simple. So I'm going to shift, if I can do that. Great, thank you. So with those objectives in mind, I know there are some of you out there that are wondering this. In fact, I know there's several of you wondering, why is Kip Takuda facilitating this panel? You know, what qualifies Kip, right? Oh, well, I shouldn't have asked that question. So, you know, with these objectives and with that question in mind, I am gonna explain a little bit about my background and how I got from there to here as a way of bringing context to this evening. So immediately, I'm not a disclaimer, and that is that I am not an academic. And for those of you who know me, you know I'm not an academic. By no stretch of the imagination. I'm a nuts and bolts guy, and I started out in 1972 as a CPS social worker. So I did that, and I have some very fond memories and some not so fond memories about that period in my life. After spending some years there, I moved over to direct a residential treatment facility. And I can remember some of those days with great fondness also. But I can remember the first night. I'm going to just draw a picture here as a way to make a point. Walking in, it was, again, I was the director. I had one of those beepers, those 24/7 beepers. The first night that I was there, I was called in about 2 a.m. And I'm not going to use her real name, but there she was. There was this young girl, 14 years old, Jenny. I walked into the place. The plate glass window in the living area was broken out. She had attempted suicide, and she was on the roof. Now, this is my first night on the job. Jenny was diagnosed as being a borderline personality with a long history of sexual abuse. And I'm not mentioning Jenny to sensationalize the issue. I'm really doing that to really bring into focus just the long-term ramifications and implications of sexual abuse. Jenny, of course, suffered immeasurable social cost. And public costs. We're getting paid, quite frankly, $350 a day to treat Jenny. Now, I have not tracked Jenny. I don't know what Jenny is doing today. I hope she's doing better. I can't guarantee that. But, you know, it was a frightening awakening to what the plight is. So there I was, CPS, residential treatment. And after a couple years, I got a call, and he really did call. It was Governor Booth Gardner. And he said, Kip, would you consider directing a small policy organization? It was then called the Governor's Council for the Prevention of Child Abuse. I said yes. He's a good guy. I liked him. And I loved the work that this small council was doing. And at that council, I met two incredible women, extraordinary women. One was Carol Jenkins, sitting right here, who was director of the statewide coalition comprised of 19 councils around the state, dedicated, focused, committed to preventing child abuse. The other woman, who I consider to be the mother of child abuse, is Bonnie Riak, a woman who worked very hard to get this council off the ground. And she pulled me to the side soon after I was appointed, and she said, Kip, you need some work here. You're a good guy, but close your eyes and think about this picture. And she said, close your eyes and think about a waterfall. Think about the water coming down. Think about children cascading off the waterfall. And at the bottom of this waterfall, you have treatment folks. You have Joan Duffel there, you know, as a personal safety trainer. You have nurses. You have the Carol Masons, the social workers. You have the law enforcement folks, the special ed folks, nurses, caretakers, picking kids up and trying to make them whole again. And then Bonnie says, now move forward, Kip. Move to the next frame. Picture another waterfall. Picture all these helping people moving to the top of the waterfall and building a white picket fence to stop these kids from falling off. And it's that simple picture. It was very simple, but it was compelling. And really, that picture is kind of stuck with me for the ensuing 20 years. It kind of drove my endeavors. So at the end of the day, the question was to me then, and it is now, is how do you take these wonderful ideas, these policy notions, these wonderful programs, and put them into practice? And that really is kind of where we're at tonight. It was a difficult challenge making that happen. I can remember Gary Locke, bless his soul. Back then, he was the chair of the Appropriations Committee, and one of my jobs, as was Laura's, was as a children's lobbyist. And I spent many a time in front of him, and I can remember him directly. He was very good at what he did. But he would look down at me, and he would say, Kip, you're a good guy. You're a nice guy. You seem to be a nice guy. But how can you guarantee to me that what you are advocating for is a good public investment? How can you tell me that by teaching personal safety classes, that by teaching parenting skills, by supporting parents in their early years, by identifying at-risk youth and providing them with early treatment, by raising public awareness, by strengthening laws to protect victims, to treat perpetrators, how can you tell me that that, in fact, is a good public investment? Well, it's been a long trek, but I can tell you today that unequivocally that, we have programs now. People, you hear what you are doing makes a difference. We can, in fact, prevent abuse in all of its form, and we can save the public money. So, and I'm sure by the time we hear our panelists this evening, you will also be very convinced. So here's how it works. We have good ideas, we have good programs, we have activists and advocates and lobbyists, and then we have policymakers. That's the cycle. And it kind of moves through. It's very simple. And So as we get going, and by the way, I'm an unapologetic advocate for prevention. I make no apologies. That's where we are. So I want to just ask as a way to get going here, do we have any law enforcement officers? No. Do we have program folks who are involved with creating ideas by implementing programs, developing programs? Okay, that's a big part of you. How about advocates and lobbyists and policy folks? I know Lori Lippold's here. Karen, okay, two of our foremost public policy folks. And I know that Senator Cole Wells is here, who is a longtime champion of children and families. Thank you for being here, Jeannie. It's great seeing you again. Mary Helen Roberts, strong advocate of children and families. You all know her. And my good friend and former colleague and the chairman of the Education Committee, Sharon Tomiko Santos. They're the folks that, we're going to bar the doors, you get them in, you're going to buttonhole them, and you're going to convince them that what we're doing is well worthwhile. Okay, let me begin as I introduce the panelists by saying that each of our learned scholars are so accomplished. They have, they're researchers, they're writers, they're speakers, they have received many awards, and I'm not going to sit here and play back their resumes. You can Google each one of them, and it's that thick. Okay, so I'm going to begin by introducing Dr. David Finkelhor. Dr. Finkelhor has been in the field, I believe, since about the mid-1970s. I first heard Dr. Finkelhor, I believe this is true, in Chicago, I think it was, and I think it was a conference sponsored by the National Committee for the Prevention of Child Abuse. So that's how far back I go back with Dr. Finkelhor. He earned his Bachelor of Science degree from Harvard in 1968, his master's degree from the Harvard Graduate School of Education in 1971, and his PhD in sociology from the University of New Hampshire in 1976. He is director of the Crimes Against Children Research Center, is co-director of the Family Research Laboratory, and professor of sociology at the University of New Hampshire. Dr. Finkelhor began his study on child victimization, child maltreatment, and family violence in 1977. In 1968, he completed his book, Child Victimization, which sought to unify and integrate knowledge and information about diverse forms of child abuse. According to Kenneth Plummer, he is probably the most prominent sociologist at work in the field of child sexual abuse. Tonight, Dr. Finkelhor will present his recent data related to child sexual abuse and offer some of his thoughts on child sexual abuse. Dr. Finkelhor, please welcome Dr. Finkelhor.
So for those of you that are alarmed to see me sort of in this doddering state, I'm recovering from some back surgery that I had. And I like to reassure people because there's this scurrilous rumor going around that I'm suffering from a degeneration from too many years of groveling for government grants. And I have, even my grant officers down in Washington can attest that I only grovel in the most ergonomic fashion. So there's nothing here, and I am getting better. So it is it's very exciting for me as well as maybe exciting for you. I'm very glad to be here, very honored to be here. I mean, Washington has a well-deserved reputation for being at the forefront of this field, and it's very exciting for me to come and be able to talk to you and to hear from you. And I've spent the day talking to people at the Committee for Children, yesterday with people at the King County Sexual Assault Center. In fact, I want to thank you for inviting me to be here. Although when Todd introduced us as distinguished speakers. I heard extinguished speakers, which I may think may be a more accurate description. But I'm going to try and maybe answer Gary Locke's question about what can we, on what basis should we support what you're doing here? Is there really much reason to think that this is likely to work or actually has been working? But I should warn you, I'm kind of a glass half full kind of guy. Do I have an image of myself here? Let's see if I can get this stuff to work. No. There I am. Some of you might say that means I'm half full of it. Maybe I'll decide that after. But I am going to start out by emphasizing what I think is some good news that I don't think has gotten sufficient attention. The people in this room, perhaps it's easier for me to talk to you than it is a lot of people because you've been working here on this topic for a long time. But I think it's very impressive to think about all that's changed on this topic in the last 40 years. All the news coverage that there has been, all the films and novels that have treated this issue, the legions of people who've received training of one sort or another, professionals on this topic, literally thousands of studies that have done on some aspect of this topic, the programs that have been developed, just the quantity of information that exists that didn't exist 40 years ago. I mean, think about how many new memes have been coined that encapsulate ideas that make reference to things that people didn't even have any concepts about before. Megan's Law, Jerry Sandusky, priest abuse, McMartin, children's advocacy centers, internet predators, good touch, bad touch, sexting. These are all things that I think call to mind things that people now know and think about in this area that just simply weren't part of the culture 40 years ago. And I think that the consciousness about sexual abuse of children that was awakened in the 20th and now the 21st century will in retrospect be viewed as a tremendous milestone in the history of child betterment. The effort to understand and remove this age-old scourge from what has been for many a nightmare of childhood, I think will be seen as a major addition to human enlightenment and will have many, many positive and lasting impacts on society as a whole. I think it's important to see that we're not the first people who've tried to protect children from sexual offending and child molestation. I think with just a little reflection, you'll realize that the instinct to protect children in this way is fairly deep and universal and maybe has even biosocial roots to it. And parts of cultural practices as diverse as things like single-gender education, burqas, statutory rape laws can at least be in part seen as efforts to protect children. But I think that the modern incarnation of this effort is different in two very, very important ways that we should acknowledge. First is that the effort has been based on a greatly more detailed and enlightened understanding of the problem and all its varieties. We always talk about the abandonment of the stranger danger model, which I do think was the thing that dominated people's awareness for an awful long time. But that's, I think, been a small part of it. There's much more. There's really been an inventory of the full variety of situations and relationships where this violation can occur, from youthful perpetrators, teachers, religious authorities, dating situations. And we have detailed the varieties of strategies and motives of offenders. We've detailed the various elements that contribute to harm, the stigma, guilt, isolation, family reaction, the ineptitude of social interveners and all of that. I think this complex of a set of understandings has been really crucial to a much more enlightened approach to this problem. And then there's a second difference that I think is less often highlighted, but has been apparent to me in recent years. And that's we've begun to disentangle the protection of children's sexual autonomy from the clinging web of the other more primitive and oppressive social practices to which it's been linked historically and culturally. So if you think about it, historically and cross-culturally, efforts to protect children's sexuality were mixed up with many, many, I think, profoundly retrograde notions. Some of them, for example, the idea that certain disfavored social groups were intrinsically sexually predatory towards children. You know, in our historical case, this has been blacks and homosexuals and immigrants. I think that the prevention efforts of the past were also historically surrounded by adult and family efforts to regulate and suppress girls and their independence. There was tight control over who girls could associate with, what they could wear. There were inflated notions about the ownership stake that families and men had in the sexuality of young females and the honor status of this. And there were efforts that, I think the efforts were also tied up with notions about the dangerous effect of sexual knowledge even, in efforts to shield children from sexual knowledge as a way of protecting their sexual autonomy. So I think we've managed to kind of liberate the efforts to protect children's sexual autonomy from some of this baggage. And that's been very important. We aren't entirely there yet by any means, as evidenced by the fact that, you know, there's still opposition to sex abuse education among some who see it as a kind of introduction of dangerous sexual knowledge. But I do think that change has been really enormous. So I want to detail more of this kind of change because I think it's so important to recognize. Let's see, am I going to... There we go. And I've broken it down into three big domains, at least in regard to its impact on preventing sexual abuse. That is law enforcement, educational programming, and public awareness. And in these domains, unfortunately, we don't have yet conclusive evaluation evidence that our approaches in these areas are working. But I do think that we can make strong cases for the value of a lot of what we're doing, although maybe not everything, because there is more generic kind of scientific, social scientific evidence behind these approaches that I would like to draw attention to. And what I'm going to do is outline what I see as some of the logic models behind the efforts that have been made in this area that I do see as having at least some evidence behind them in support of what we're doing. Although in some areas you'll see, I think it's a little bit lean. So let me talk a little bit about law enforcement. Okay, there we go. It is impressive what's happened in the law enforcement domain. We have had a massive mobilization on the part of law enforcement to flush cases of sexual offending against children out of the underbrush here, where it was very, very little attended to in generations past. We've had a huge amount of training of police and prosecutors in how to investigate and conduct prosecutions, and training of judges. We've had massive revisions of legal statutes to facilitate all of this. Is there evidence that it actually has helped? Well, one thing that it's clearly done is it's taken a lot of individuals who have a proclivity to abuse children out of circulation. The data I have show a tripling between the early 1990s and the mid-2000s. It's probably gone up even since a lot since then. There is evidence in the criminology field that when you take offenders out of circulation, it does reduce the crime rate. In fact, studies of crime in general have shown that incarceration is maybe responsible for about a third of the decline in crime that we've seen in the United States since the early 1990s. Aggressive law enforcement has also reduced the chance for continued or renewed offending by catching people at earlier stages in their offending cycle. And we also know that once people have been caught, although some do reoffend, the recidivism rate is actually relatively low, under 20% overall, and even considerably lower than that for some classes of offenders. And that tends to be a much lower rate of reoffending than you have for what we know about people who don't get caught, who seem to continue, are much more likely to continue on their path of offending. The other thing that the law enforcement effort has done is it, I believe, deterred a lot of offending by conveying that there's a considerable likelihood that you're going to get caught because so many people have, and there's been so much publicity about that. We don't know the direct effects of that, but overall in the criminology field, there have been a number of findings that show that the most important thing, the most important way to deter offending is to give offenders a sense that there's a relatively high likelihood of them getting caught. The severity of the offending, of the penalty is much less important than the sense that the likelihood of getting caught is high. So the reasons to think that the logic model with regard to our aggressive criminal justice efforts could be working. I think another area of prevention that we don't often think about because it involves less the people in this room than people who are out there probably doing broadcasts or writing up their stories for tomorrow morning's papers is the enormous amount of public awareness that's occurred about this issue in the media. The volume of newspaper stories and magazine articles and television programs on this topic. I don't think it's fair to say, as you sometimes hear people say, that this is an issue that nobody talks about. It's a topic that gets a tremendous amount of coverage, I think, in comparison to other social problems. And I think we have reasons to think that that has had a very positive effect. For one thing, it's been an important part of the deterrence paradigm, that people hear about this and realize that people know that it's occurring and know that and get caught. But I also think it's likely had a big effect on guardianship, as parents and other people involved in children's lives know about this problem and think about different ways to help protect them by making choices about who they let their kids hang out with, or even choices about who they hook up with or remarry, or choices about what to talk to their children about. Improved guardianship is another factor. Victim stigma reduction, I think, is also something that we might well expect from this kind of greater awareness. That is to say, one of the classic elements to the sexual abuse situation of people in generations past was growing up, never hearing this talked about and thinking that you were the only person that this occurred to. That doesn't happen anymore. And there's a lot of reason to think that people who grow up today who've had these kinds of experiences don't feel so isolated, don't feel stigmatized by it, and get a fair amount of information from the media that helps in putting it in some kind of context and making meaning out of what actually happened to them. We don't know specifically that happens, but we do know from the studies that have been done of treatment with young people who have been sexually abused, that getting information, getting accurate information, particularly about stigma, does seem to be an important factor in reducing the long-term effect of sexual abuse. So there is some empirical basis for thinking that would be helpful. Finally, an enormous amount has gone on in the whole education field with, a lot of you, sounds like, have been involved in that. efforts to provide education to parents, to provide education to young people in schools, to provide education to young people in youth-serving organizations. Once again, it would be nice to know that we had clinical trials showing that this reduced sexual abuse. We don't have that, but what we do have is a considerable body of research that suggests that the kind of skill building that you get with this kind of education in other areas like drug abuse prevention, resistance skills, the awareness skills, decision-making skills, actually are effective in reducing social problem behavior in these other areas. So I think there's a strong reason for thinking that in the area of sexual abuse prevention, sexual assault prevention, they're likely to be successful as well. We do have some evidence that these kinds of programs, even in the area of sexual abuse, do promote a disclosure. There's also reason to think that they help in reduction of secondary harm. That is to say that kids who've been exposed to these kinds of programs are less likely to think that what happened was their fault, or to feel guilt and shame about what happened, or to sort of keep quiet about what was going on. So stigma reduction. I think there's a possibility, although this is something we don't really have much evidence about, that exposure to these programs by creating empathy for victims and awareness about the problem may do something to prevent the development of offending behavior among children who might otherwise have gone on to have those kinds of careers. And that these kinds of programs, especially to the extent that they educate teachers and child-serving individuals and people who work in organizations that work with young people, have improved guardianship as well. So here is, I think, though, the best news that all of that has been having some effect. There's quite a bit of national and large-scale study trend information on sexual abuse and sexual assault that suggests that over the last 20 years there have been some major improvements. This shows data from the two large agency sources. One, the child protection agencies from all over the country, aggregated by the National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System, showing over the past 20 years over 60% decline in substantiated sexual abuse that these agencies are aware of. And the other line is evidence that comes from police, who collect reports about sexual assaults that show a 36% decline in forcible rape. Now, this isn't, the police data doesn't break information down by the age of victim, but we know from other police sources that over 50% of what gets seen in police blotters as forcible rape involves persons under the age of 18. So these are largely, a majority, kids that are declining. But in addition to the agency-based data, we also have large-scale national survey data that shows major improvements. This is from the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is the largest crime victimization survey in the country. Over 100,000 people every year, shows a 66% decline in teens reporting sexual assaults in the past year. Over the last 15 to 17 years, this survey, here's another survey, and there are a couple others, the National Survey of Family Growth, that shows a rather large reduction in the percentage of females who say that their first sexual intercourse occurred before the age of 15 with an individual who was 3 or more years older than them. And there's actually a number of other data sources that point to similar improvements, which I take to be good news and strong endorsement for the kinds of policies and efforts that we've been making over the years. Okay, but we still have people like this. He seems to be remarkably chipper in the face of what he's facing. But you look at cases like this and you think, how can we see ourselves as having had some success when somebody could be molesting so many kids for such a long period of time, and so many people who you would think would have done a good job of outing him and taking care of this didn't. And I think it does illustrate that there is a long way to go. There still are far too many kids who are being abused. There's still far too many people who don't seem to have gotten the message. And we do have a lot we need to do. So I don't want anybody to go away here thinking that I think we're taking care of the issue. There are a lot of things I could talk about, but with a short period of time, I just want to emphasize a few things that to me seem like they are issues that need more attention and places where we can expand our efforts to maybe get more bang for the buck that we've been spending. One of them is to expand a lot of the awareness that we've been doing to include various other forms of sexual abuse that haven't perhaps gotten as much attention. I think maybe the Sandusky case has been very useful in drawing attention to the sexual abuse of boys, which may have been relatively neglected. I think the issue of the abuse of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender kids is another important area that's been neglected. I think the issue of young people being sexually victimized by their peers in dating situations is another that's maybe gotten not enough attention. And I think a particular area has to do with this issue of young people who have sexual relationships, quasi-voluntary sexual relationships, with persons who are substantially older. I do think we probably have not, as a society and as advocates and prevention educators, done enough to emphasize what's wrong with sex between adolescents and substantially older people. And I think this is an area where the norms are unclear and where a clarification of the norms might really make a big impact on reducing this kind of abuse, especially in an era when young people seem to be highly sexualized. It's easy for adults to think, hey, why not just party with them? And we really need to, I think, do a lot more talking, both to young people and to adults, about why we have these rules, about not having relationships with teenagers, about it being developmentally appropriate, about the expectations on adult to mentor, not gratify their own needs, about the notions of development and inability to consent. These are things we don't talk about enough, and I think if we did and learned to do it in a structured way, we might make an impact on this problem. It's interesting, a third of all arrests for sex crimes against children are for statutory sexual offenses in the United States. It's a statistic that's not really all that well recognized and is very important. I do think we need to be making a lot more efforts toward youth-serving organizations. There are lots of places where kids hang out where, for one reason or another, they haven't kind of gotten word about what they should be doing to protect kids, from sports organizations to small church-based group. I think having off-the-shelf prevention materials that these organizations can use at low cost would be very, very helpful. I think guidelines that they can take on about appropriate guidelines for behavioral interaction in these settings would be very useful. I think something that we haven't recognized enough is that our notion of pedophile molesters doesn't recognize how often non-pedophile individuals who aren't necessarily looking for a sexual relationship with children, find themselves drawn into these relationships because of personal needs they have, and the fact that working with and mentoring kids can involve an intimacy that they did not expect. I don't think we do enough to prepare adults who go into working with children for the kinds of feelings that can come up in these intimate interactions with children, who are sometimes, acting in ways that seem very sexual. And we need, I think, to do a lot more to help adults to cope with those kinds of feelings. I don't think we raise that issue, and I don't think we have provided tools for adults for dealing with that. We learned a lot in recent years about the role of bystanders. I think we understand much more that there are frequently young people themselves who are aware of what's going on in the lives of their friends and schoolmates, but who don't really act in ways that are effective to prevent them. I think we can learn a lot more from talking to them and nurturing their interests and desire to help their peers by giving them kinds of skills to intervene in situations that help protect their friends. I think there's a lot more that we can, I think proven that getting disclosures to law enforcement has been very helpful, but I think law enforcement is still not a child-friendly place in a lot of communities for a lot of kids. We can do a lot more for helping make it child-friendlier and pitching to the community as a whole that law enforcement actually has stepped over this threshold and they are good guys and women to talk to about this issue and will react appropriately in many places, but I think we could do a lot more in that. And then finally, I think we need to think about how to integrate the sex abuse prevention into other prevention efforts. The Committee for Children is doing a wonderful job on that, but I think we have to think about all the places where we can do that, because increasingly it's just not cost-effective or politically possible to have standalone sex abuse prevention education going on when all kinds of prevention demands are being made of policymakers everywhere. So I put this up because it's funny, not because it means anything. But it does allow me to make the point that I don't think I don't think the sexual abuse crisis is over, and I don't think we've won, but I do think that we've made some substantial progress, and we really can take heart that the things that we've been doing are having an effect, and it should energize us to do more and allow us to give a response to some of the skeptics about why they should invest money in what we're trying to do. So thank you very much.
So that picture of Jerry Sandusky conjured up all kinds of things for me personally. And there are upsides, as Dr. Finkelhor mentioned. You know, it's given me great license to talk to my 15-year-old about the whole issue of sexuality and what's appropriate and what not. Ironically, in talking with her, I found out that she knows a whole lot more than I do about the subject. So I don't know if that's good or I think that's a good thing. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Keith Kaufman, and I'm going to take a little bit of license here because Dr. Kaufman does have a real, whether you know it or not, a real soft spot in my heart. Yeah, you do. So Dr. Kaufman, first of all, is a professor, a clinical psychology professor at Portland State University. And he has in the past served as the department chair from 1998 to 2007. So now I'm going to just kind of deviate just a moment here. You know, I am not an academic. I mentioned that. And at the beginning of this fall, I'm a Husky, the University of Washington, traveled down to Louisiana State, and they got pulverized. It's like 53-3. I mean, it was 43-3. I mean, it was just demoralizing, and I thought this is the beginning of a horribly dismal season. But there was light at the end of the tunnel. The following week, we played Portland State University. We beat them 50-something to 20. In that one subtle move, you know, you uplifted, you raised the self-esteem, the self-concept of 80 demoralized football players. I want to thank you, Dr. Kaufman. So Dr. Kaufman, while in Oregon, he has served in many capacities. He's currently the president of the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers. He is considered one of the foremost experts on the assessment and treatment of both child sexual abuse victims and juvenile sexual offenders and their families. Dr. Kaufman has done extensive research on the prevention of child sexual abuse and the treatment of adult and juvenile offenders. He is, in particular, currently completing and we talked about this briefly, child sexual abuse prevention study funded by the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, looking at risk factors related to offender modus operandi and parental supervision across 3 ethnic cultural groups. And I'm told that The analysis of the data is is going on right now, and the results should be published, I'm sure, at some point in the future. Dr. Kaufman tonight will present ideas related to child sexual abuse prevention strategies, including his extensive work with Boys and Girls Clubs. Please welcome Dr. Kaufman.
Well, thank you. I'm very honored to be here. And I just want to say that one of the really wonderful things about speaking around the country is the fact that most every team that plays Portland State beats them. So people are always very kind to me. But I'm very excited about being here this evening to talk a little bit about the prevention of child sexual abuse and how to enhance prevention. And let me begin by saying that the American Medical Association has described child sexual abuse as a silent, violent epidemic. And historically, if we take a look at the response, both in terms of monetary investment and also service to child sexual abuse, unfortunately, we've invested most of our money in after-the-fact services and treatment. And that's not to say that that's not a good place to put money, but that's meant that there's been very little money left to invest in prevention. As a matter of fact, Prevent Child Abuse America estimated that for every dollar we invested in after-the-fact services, we were spending a single penny on prevention. Now, this is particularly critical because what we know is, as George Albee said, no mass disorder afflicting mankind is ever brought under control or eliminated by attempts at treating the individual. And so clearly, part of my talk this evening, and it's probably most likely singing to the choir, but is that we really need to enhance our investment in prevention, both in terms of our personal commitments and the time we're spending, but especially in terms of our investment of dollars. With the short time that I have this evening, I'd like to do two things. First, I'd like to talk about some strategic ways of approaching prevention to enhance what we're doing. And I'll start by talking about a general prevention model and then talk about some of the key factors and how they apply to the prevention of child sexual abuse in particular. And then the second thing I'd like to do is very briefly tell you about a project I'm very excited about, working on a collaboration with Boys and Girls Clubs of America on a sustainable prevention approach that they can use with their 4,000 plus clubs across the country. So I want to tell you a little bit about that. So here's the part where, much like Kip's introduction, I want you to not quite close your eyes, but I want you to imagine yourself walking down this river. And I want you to imagine that suddenly you're not alone, that unfortunately there's someone in the water that needs your help. And what do? Well, of course you offer them some kind of help. Now I'd like you to imagine further that within a short period of time, it's not just one person in the river. There's a whole host of people in the river. And what do? Well, first off, you find a better river to walk next to, right? But the second thing that you hopefully do is you find a way to help all of those folks who are in the river, right? That makes sense. My hope would also be that this is the point at which you decide not to spend your time standing by the river giving out life rings, but instead this is the point where you start to look upstream. And this is the point where you start to ask yourself questions about what are the risks that have led to these people being in the water. And if you were to do that, this town or city, what you might find is that there's this absolutely horrendous bridge that people insist on using as a shortcut. You might also find that this is part of a party city, and that people go out on the boat, and unfortunately they drink while they're on the boat, and that means that some of them end up in the water. And moreover, what you might find is that local business and industry isn't as good as they should be about safety precautions for their workers. And further, that this is a hot spot for children and for teenagers for playing, and there aren't always adults to supervise them. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be throwing those life rings to people. Clearly we need to do that, but we really need to ensure that everyone knows that throwing those life rings is not enough to solve the problem, because that's what we've been doing for 30 years. If we're really going to make strides in terms of eradicating sexual violence, we really need to be thinking about how we strategically go about enhancing prevention. Now, let me start by talking about some strategic moves, because we're concerned about all those people in the water. And then in a minute, I'll talk about child sexual abuse. I want to talk very briefly about two forms of prevention, lots of different definitions of prevention. But here, let me start with primary prevention. And when I talk about primary prevention here, I'm talking about prevention that's directed towards the general public, that's intended to enhance knowledge, attitudes, skills for healthy living and to prevent risks, and it's applied prior to the onset of risks. I'll also be describing efforts for secondary prevention. And when I talk about secondary prevention, I'm talking about efforts that are directed towards at-risk groups. So in our more general example, we might be talking about people who work on the river as at-risk people. And here we're seeking to reduce the risks that could lead to the problem. And it's applied after the risks exist, but before the problem has actually manifested. So let's take a look at some strategic advantages of looking at enhancements and investments in prevention. So first off, one of the distinct advantages is the fact that looking upstream and investing in prevention offers us a chance to intervene at multiple levels. So for example, we could start by, at the individual level, teaching more people to swim, making sure that they have personal flotation devices. At the relationship level, we can be ensuring that more parents are at the riverside and in the water and supervising their children. At the institutional level, we can make sure that business and industry takes safety seriously, make sure that their workers have the right equipment. And at the community level, we could make sure that the sheriff's department is patrolling the waters, making sure that those partiers on those boats are having fun, but not ending up drinking too much and not ending up in the water. And finally, at a societal level, we can look at standards for bridges. And we can look at whether or not our rickety little bridge is really anywhere near meeting that standard, making sure that people are intervening. We can also look upstream to look at creating a better balance between our investment and after-the-fact services and prevention. Here the contrast is the person standing downriver throwing rings to try to pick the people out of the water, as opposed to all the people that we can get to participate in prevention, from the individuals who are being taught about swimming, to the workers, to the sheriff's department, and to parents. So prevention really offers us opportunities to include everybody in the solution. We can also be strategic with prevention, where we can pick out particular levels that we're not intervening sufficiently enough. For example, here at the societal level, if we go look at the literature on bridges nationally, we find that on any given day there are thousands of bridges that don't meet standards and really aren't safe. Although I'm not sure they were talking about that bridge. We can also work on creating that balance, as I mentioned before. We can be investing in things like more patrols. We can be investing in putting more lifeguards on the riverfront. So that's the general case for prevention. That's what we need to be thinking about from a strategic standpoint. So let me talk just a little bit about how that now applies to the specific case of doing better about preventing child sexual abuse. As I said earlier, one of the distinct advantages is that we can intervene at multiple levels. What we know is when we intervene at multiple levels, our efforts are much more effective. So here at the individual level, we can be ensuring that every youth has exposure to school-based, child-focused prevention, much like what Committee for Children does every day. At the relationship level, We can make sure that the information is going out to parents to support those kinds of skills and attitudes and knowledge information. We can make sure that parents know more about looking out for what it means to be looking at grooming behavior, or what it means to understand children who are demonstrating at-risk types of behaviors themselves. At the institution level, we can help schools ensure that they themselves have the kind of policies that promote healthy relationships, and that there are reasonable consequences when youth at school engage in inappropriate behaviors. At the community level, we can use some of the wonderful things that we've learned about bystander intervention to include people from across the community to intervene when they see at-risk behavior. And from a societal standpoint, we can be better about intervening with the media, trying to get the media to have more appropriate messages a greater amount of the time. So intervening at multiple levels simultaneously to be more effective with prevention. We can also think about tipping the balance back in favor of a sufficient investment of services and money with regard to prevention. And what that might look like is increases in federal research funding, prevention program funding. It would include looking at what we do in terms of investing in both victim and offender prevention efforts. And I would say that the argument, the one that we hear most often about why there's not more money for prevention, is because it's all spent. Well, part of my answer to that is there are a number of places that we currently put money in communities and in states where the research data suggests that it's not keeping, those strategies are not keeping the community safer. I think we should get that money back, reinvest it in programs that are evidence-based and that would move things forward in terms of the eradication of sexual violence. I also mentioned that one of the things this approach allows us to do is strategically look at areas that have been neglected. And David had mentioned this in his talk. I think that one of the areas that we have neglected is institutional or youth-serving organizations. And let me tell you a little bit about why I feel so strongly about that. If you take a look at the data, it's an understatement to say that a large number of youth are involved in youth-serving organizations. Every day we send more than 57 million youth to school. Estimates are that more than 41 million youth participate in youth sports. And that doesn't include the smaller youth-serving organizations that count in the millions the number of children who participate in their programs, like Boys and Girls Clubs, Boy Scouts, Big Brothers and Big Sisters, and there's a whole host of them. So clearly, there's a large number of youth who are involved. At the same time, I don't want to mislead you. Most of these organizations, especially the big ones, do invest efforts in creating a safer environment. But at the same time, we know that there are still children and teenagers who get abused in these settings. And unfortunately, there's no national tracking, but we know this from the general media. We see these stories all the time. They're easy to Google. Some of them, like Sandusky and others, become part of our daily life for long periods of time. We also know that organizations that have less resources probably represent more of a risk because they don't have the resources to invest in some of the safety things that we'd like to see. So that led me to a collaboration with Boys and Girls Club of America. My contact there, or my collaborator, is Les Nichols, who's the Vice President for Club Safety and Design. And we had some wonderful funding, or we have some wonderful funding from the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape, and we have their Vision of Hope grant, which is a 2-year grant in this case. The goal of this project is twofold. First off, as I mentioned, our intent is to create a self-assessment approach that any or all of the 4,000 clubs across the United States can do on their own. And it has to be low or no cost, it has to be sustainable, has to be something that can be done simply, has to be something that's comprehensive, and something that can be tailored to 4,000 different types of settings. The second thing is once we have that model, is to look at its effectiveness. And just to give you a little bit of detail on this, this approach is based on something called situational prevention. And actually, situational prevention has been used successfully for more than 70 years around the world to create safe housing, for more than 20 years in crime prevention. It focuses on, pretty simply, identifying all of the risks in a particular environment and then either creating prevention or risk reduction strategies to respond to those risks. It's also a particularly good fit for youth-serving organizations. Let me just take a minute and give you a sense of what are some of the areas that we look at as part of the brainstorming. And I'll point out to you that this center white area are the dimensions that the clubs have a little bit more control over. The black area around it are the dimensions that exist in the community that the clubs have some control over, but not quite as much. So we brainstorm around areas like at-risk characteristics of youth. So that might include youth who come to the club particularly emotionally needy or developmentally delayed, or it may reflect their family situation and difficulties at home. We also brainstorm around specific locations that are high-risk locations in the club, on the club grounds, and in the places that the clubs go to as part of field trips and as part of their summer camp. We also look at what we call facilitators. So, for example, on a nice June day, when people would rather be somewhere else than work, if you have a bunch of people who go ahead and call off work, that changes the staff to youth ratio that creates a risk. We look at issues around health, like mold in the wall. We look at accident prevention. It might be a broken sidewalk or old gym equipment. We look at physical safety concerns like conflict between youth. We also look at club policies. Are they there? Are they the right ones? Are they ones that are actually shared with the employees? Then moving to the community, we look at community policies that impact the youth. If the youth go to a community swimming pool, they bump into community policies. We also look at the lifestyle and routine activities of the families. If you have a single parent who works 2 jobs, they may have to drop their youth off an hour before the club opens in the summer, pick up that youth an hour after. We look at what are the larger risks in the community environment. Some of the clubs we worked with, 40% of the buildings in the area were abandoned. There's gang activity. I should mention that those are the 7 areas we brainstorm about. The model also pays attention to things like offender issues. How many are in the area? How well are they supervised? What kind of treatment do they get? And of course, we also attend to the influence of socioeconomic factors. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of the risk assessment that we do in the brainstorming. In the first year, we worked with 7 clubs across 3 cities, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Portland, to develop a model. That led to the development of an implementation manual that we're just starting to use to test out in 16 different clubs across 4 different states to look at satisfaction and effectiveness. What we hope to do in the future is expand this model to look at how it works with other organizations. We've done some things with children's hospitals. We're starting to have some discussions with faith-based organizations, and we're also going to work on measurement. The last thing I want to mention to you is going back to that idea that prevention offers a role for everyone. Now, you'll be getting in the mail, in your email, a copy of this talk. You'll also be getting a handout with some resources. But I'll very quickly mention to you that there's a whole host of things that we can offer to different groups to be participants in this solution. Parents can seek out information. They can learn about ways that offenders groom. They can work on their communication. Professionals can make sure that they're actively screening as part of their practice. Can make sure that they're educating parents and other professionals. They can also be advocates and experts in the development of prevention. Children and teen, just the kind of work that is being done by Committee for Children, development of strong basic skills. We can teach them where to look for help. We can help them develop healthy relationships. And as teenagers, we can make sure that there's a focus on healthy sexuality. For community members, we can have an emphasis on what are risk factors, early risk factors, and how can we empower them as bystanders to intervene. Albert Einstein said that intellectuals solve problems and geniuses prevent them. Please be a genius. Find a role, find strategies that fit for you, and make prevention a part of what you do every week. Thank you.
So in light of recent events, it's really appropriate that Dr. Shakeshaft is here this evening. Dr. Charles Shakeshaft, has been on the cutting edge of research considered by some, I suspect, as highly controversial, and certainly gutsy by others. Dr. Shakeshaft's research exposes a frightening phenomena that by some standards seems near epidemic. Dr. Shakeshaft is a renowned educational researcher noted for her work on sexual abuse by school staff, and her findings, I suspect, will surprise you. Dr. Shakeshaft's research sheds light on the plight of students in the public school system. As an expert, she has appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show, PBS, and on THS Investigates. Dr. Shakeshaft received her Bachelor's of Science from the University of Nebraska and her Master's and PhD from Texas A&M. She left Hofstra University in 2007 for Virginia Commonwealth University, where she currently serves as the department chairperson and professor of the Department of Educational Leadership School of Education. Tonight, Dr. Shakeshaft will be talking about educator misconduct and necessary policies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shakeshaft.
Okay, according to my watch, we're supposed to be done with these talks by now so that we can open up the floor to discussion. So I do talk fast. I could just sum it up. People who are employed in schools sexually abuse kids. We don't do anything about it. Let's change that. All right. Whoops. Oh, you know, I said I'd do this. We have very little research on on sexual abuse of kids by people employed in schools. We don't track those numbers. We have really just one data set that we can use. We don't seem to care about tracking those numbers, although I'll point out we know exactly how many reindeer there are in Alaska. So what we do know is that from the one study we have, 9.6% of students report some form of sexual misconduct directed toward them, and about 8% both, and about 7%, 6.7%, have experienced physical sexual misconduct. Now I want to say a word about why I use the term misconduct. I just focus on schools. School people often, and I know you're out there so you can jump up and correct me, but school people sometimes object to calling acts sexual abuse that they consider to be sexual harassment, bad judgment, stupid behavior, and I'm a school person, just so you're clear, and so I've years ago put together the term educator sexual misconduct to say this: it's the educator who has the misconduct. It ranges from things that we don't want educators to do, but that are not criminal acts, to things that are criminal acts. But just because they're not criminal acts doesn't mean we want that teacher in the classroom doing them. So I want to encompass the range of things that we see in schools that are sexual in nature, from adults to kids, and so that's why I call it educator sexual misconduct. That little number that I pointed out is about 4.5 million kids are subjected to some form of sexual misconduct in our schools. While it's not the big numbers that you might see for parental or for other sexual abuse, it is a very large number of kids in our schools who are targets of sexual misconduct. Some of the offender patterns, and I'll just briefly talk about them, are that First, we don't have any data available about the number of school staff. We don't know how many teachers, how many adult sexually abused kids. The reason we have kid data is because these are surveys of kids, asking them about things that have happened. We have none about adults. There was an AP study that identified 2,570 teachers who lost their licenses, but remember, those are the ones that are brought forward. From the study we have of kids, it would appear that only about 11% of the kids actually report the abuse, and of those who report, a much, much smaller number, something happens to the teacher. So this would be a very low estimate if we were to try to figure it out. Of those who are offenders, 57% are males, 43% are females. I have to be honest, when I first started doing this work, which was by accident, because I teach school administrators, but many years ago someone asked me a question and there was no answer, and I decided to try to find it, and I'm still trying to find it. I would have been surprised at that 42.8% of abusers in schools. It's probably not, it isn't so surprising now that I know more. And remember, 75% of school employees are women. So 75% of school employees are women, and they account for 43% of the abuse. And 25% of school employees are men, and they account for 57% of the abuse. So it's important to look at also those balances there. We looked at, the role that people play, and basically the major role are teachers and coaches. And I think you're getting this PowerPoint. So, and it's mainly people who have the opportunity to be alone with kids: music teachers, tutors, coaches, kind of after-school supervisors. There's more abuse from those people in those roles than there are from people in other roles. The targets are slightly more likely to be female, disproportionately of African descent and Latino. Students with disabilities are very much represented as targets, and often vulnerable children who may come from unstable or dysfunctional contexts or families are overrepresented. Some patterns. At the elementary level, and this is important, this is just at the elementary level. At the elementary level, the offender is often an outstanding teacher. There's a disproportionate number of teacher awards among offenders. They've been best teacher of the year, best teacher of the state, best teacher here, best teacher there. And so people don't suspect that that teacher could do anything. And in fact, when an accusation is made, are often outraged that anyone would accuse this really great teacher. Now, in terms of the really great teacher, that teacher was a really great teacher probably to 98% of the kids that she or he served. So that 98% can't imagine that this really great teacher would do anything. But to the 2% of kids that teacher sexually abused, that's not a really great teacher. There's a kind of a slow process of grooming and selection. We'll find that sometimes teachers start when the children are in their class in the 4th grade or 3rd grade and not act in a particularly direct sexual way until 6th grade. So, or start at the beginning of the year or over the summer. There's a lot of grooming and selection. There's a lot of, in working with offenders, a lot of asking kids questions and saying things like, and I'm focusing on elementary right now, I'm going to tell you something and you can't tell. It's really important that you don't tell. And then they say something silly like, I really like green ties, or I like to eat candy in bed. Well, and so they check and keep checking. And so the idea is to see who's not going to tell. There's a focus on types in the elementary level, not so much in the secondary. And fixated abusers are more likely in the elementary and early middle school. So those are abusers that we might call pedophiles. And they, as far as we can tell, are the majority at the early years of the sexual abusers. Not all of them are fixated abusers, but there are more there. In middle and upper levels, we find not so many fixated abusers, but rather opportunistic abusers who, just take advantage of whatever comes along from the upper middle school to the and high school kids. So these may or may not be serial offenders. They're not necessarily seen as outstanding teachers. They don't specifically focus on a particular kind of children, and they do target the adolescents. They often go quicker. There's not as much planning. They're more easily identified and able to be, there's able to see where there could be an intervention. They're often teachers who are emotionally arrested. They're still in high school themselves emotionally. Teachers who have boundary issues and boundary problems, and teachers who may have, loneliness at home, who may not have had a lot of friends, who, there's all kinds of reasons. Or just plain teachers who want to have sex and they're happy to have it with whomever they can have it with, whenever, at any time. So that's that group. And those two groups are fairly different. In the grooming, and especially at the elementary level, there is a pattern, and this is mostly a male-to-male pattern, and it goes something like this. The abuser or the offender targets a vulnerable male, usually a male who's in a single-parent family, and the parent who's available is the female. Now, this is a female who's feeling guilty because her boy isn't getting a lot of the kind of male modeling that she hopes, because she doesn't have the dad there. And this feels really bad to her. And along comes this teacher who won the Outstanding Teacher of the Year award, and this teacher says to her, Mrs. Smith, I just want to say that your son is really extraordinary. I know he hasn't done well in school before, but really, I see an enormous amount of promise in this boy. He just needs some special help. I would just hate it if we didn't give it to him. And the mother's like, oh my gosh, thank you, because somebody here who's this really great guy is going to help my child, going to help my boy. And so it starts with this kind of help from school, tutoring, and then it goes into, checking with the mom, and then things like, John mentioned he liked to go to baseball games. Do you like baseball games? And she says, no. And he says, I'll take him. I go every now and again. I'm happy to do that. Or he likes to go camping. I'll take him. In fact, before I started studying this, and I've looked at least 1,000 cases in schools, I never knew there were so many hunting lodges that people took children to. Hunting lodges, that's a big one. If somebody has a hunting lodge, fire them. No. And so there's trips, there's presents, and what the child gets, of course, which is that they get attention, they get focused, they feel valuable, they feel important, they feel loved, and then they feel upset and confused, but still important and loved, and it's all very confusing for that child because this person has put enormous amount of energy into that child, grooming the child, getting the child to really care about him. We don't, despite Mary Lou or Mary Jo Latrina, we don't get as many female to male latrine. What is it? No. Okay, you know who it is. I just have a blank. I can't help it. It's just beyond my hope. But we don't see as many female to male in the elementary. We see lots of female to male in the middle and upper. In the study where we saw, 43% of the offenders were females, the majority of those were upper middle school into high school. But there still are female to male in the elementary schools, and we found very few. In fact, in the study we have, there was 0 number of female to female in the elementary level, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And then male to female. So it goes sort of in incidence, it's male to female, male to male, female to male, and female to female. And so we see some of those patterns happen with females. With females, they tend not to be the patterns where the adult male is asking the female to go to the baseball game. That more happens in school where, for instance, a really good first-chair flute player. Stay after school, I'm going to help you with your work. Would you like to be my monitor, my classroom monitor? Do you want to help with the music? I need somebody to organize the music. Let me just come in and help you up with this. And so the patterns for those tend not to involve the parents so much when it's male to female in the elementary, but do have the child who in this case tends usually to be a female student who is outstanding in some way as well. So she may be the first chair flute, she may be really good at debating, she may be an excellent math student, but is shy or introverted, or may come from a family where there's dysfunction and she's not feeling all that good about herself, and it happens at school. And so it's all around the school happening. Other incidents, I've seen more than enough of the time when the teacher has a movie in the room and will go to the back of the room and the child sits on the teacher's lap and the teacher unzips his pants and pulls down the pants of the female child while the other children are watching the movie. This is not uncommon. Going into closets while the other children are working and saying, "Mary, come here." Incidents where boys know that the teacher's going to bring them up behind the desk to look at their paper and say, this is why I graded it this way, but in the meantime is putting the hand on the desk, touching the boy. And the boys, say, "I'm not going close." They're aware of it. They try to avoid it. It's known, but they don't report it. However, anybody who had ears would hear the boys saying that in the hallway and other places and could put some things together and try to figure it out. Geography, that's what I say. It's in lots of places. Very often, it's, "I'm going to take you home from volleyball practice. Oh, wait a minute. I need to stop by my house and pick something up. Do you mind if we just stop? Oh, why don't you just, while I find it, why don't you just come in and have a Coke?" And then from there. Or for boys, "Why don't you come in and we can read magazines, watch videos, and have alcohol." That's just I'm talking fast to get done. Most sexual misconduct is not reported. When it's reported, it's often ignored. Informal channels are common. Somebody tells another teacher, and the other teacher doesn't report it on. Kids don't know who the person is they're supposed to tell. And one of the unfortunate laws or legal rulings is that if the child tells the wrong person, too bad, the school's not liable. Well, children don't know that you're supposed to tell the principal or you're supposed to tell this person, not the teacher in the second grade. And so this is a real problem because how's the kid supposed to know? The kid's told, thinks something's going to be done, and nothing does happen. False allegations are rare despite what people say in the schools. Most teachers know how to deal with kids who might tell a lie. Bobby took my homework. I finished this. I deserved an A, not a B. We know how to do that. And so any allegation that's made is not well enough made to be upheld within a serious set of questions. So if we do it right, false allegations are really rare. Prevention. Strong statements with policies, strong statements of commitment, describing it as illegal. I'm not going to go through all these since you will get this PowerPoint, and I'm trying to get you time to ask questions. But I try to put in some specifics about what we might like in policies because the policies need to be really specific, and most school district policies are not specific. A policy itself will not stop educator sexual misconduct, but it's a beginning for a lot of things. So these are some policy statements. There's a lot of things I want you to say. Supervision. We need administrators and others to walk into classrooms, walk through the building, listen to rumors and gossip. I can't tell you how many times I've heard an administrator say, "Oh yeah, I heard the kids saying something like that, but I can't act on rumor and gossip." Oh yes, you can, and you'd better, because you're not going to have a kid come in to you and say, "I just want to tell you about what happened to me." That isn't the way it goes. And so if we don't, in education, understand that we need to listen to the pitter-patter of the kids' talk, we're not going to be able to understand what's going on. Warning signs, doors closed, windows covers up, students alone with the teacher. Before and after school, administrators forget to walk around during those times. Those are really good times to walk around and see, are there rooms where there are a teacher and kids in the room? Follow up on everything. People often don't follow up. They hear about it. A typical thing is somebody says, this teacher, I believe, is having some kind of weird relationship or doing something that I'm not sure what it is, but I think you ought to check into it with this child. Principal calls the teacher in and says, I've got somebody who said you might be doing something maybe sexual with this child. The teacher says, no, I don't know where that would come from. And the administrator says, okay, and that's it. Now, you think I'm kidding, but I'm not. That's where it ends. It's okay, that's it. We need to remind staff over and over again of expectations, what we expect, how we expect them to behave, and not with things like appropriate conduct. You can't imagine how many things just say we expect appropriate conduct. It's not enough. We need to tell them what appropriate conduct is. Don't assume, and educate. Educate all staff. Educate students, educate parents, work with local police departments. But what I want to focus on is just to say educate all staff. So we educate students, that's a peripheral. I don't think students should have to be responsible for their own safety, all right? And we don't do enough to make the adults responsible. So too many schools say, in order for me to investigate or do anything, the student has to come in and make a written complaint, and turn it in. And if the student doesn't do that, we don't move on it. So we have to get back to the notion that it's everybody's responsibility, and the adults have to be in charge. Educate, avoid one-shot training, work with programs. I really like the programs we saw today, which are integrated into a larger set of curriculum that you keep coming back to the issues. Don't assume that the mandated reporter training that schools might have is sufficient on this, because what we find is people have a disconnect between mandated reporter, which has to do with families out there, and people in the schools. And you need to really work with the community and talk with the community, and state and national level, work with law enforcement, train hearing officers when teachers are brought up on charges, work for laws that require and fund training, work for laws that require reporting and penalize those who fail to report. And that's that. All right.
I would have hated to have debated Dr. Shakeshaft. That was terrific. There's a place for you at our dinner table tomorrow night. I want you to talk to a couple daughters.
I'm Janice Palm from Shepherd's Counseling Services, and we provide therapy for adults who've been sexually abused as children. So we're kind of on the other end. Wish more of this had happened. I have a question, and I think this is maybe primarily for Dr. Finkelhor, and in light of the statistics that we heard about kids reporting in schools, 11%, and that seems, consistent. How do you gather the data that says, the incidences are going down? It seems like there's a gap, and sort of an intuitive sense of that between what's reported and how we gather statistics that say, okay, we can say it's going down, which is great news, but can you?
The data come from a variety of different sources. There's agency data and there's victim data. Probably the one that's most persuasive to me is the victim data, of course, because these are based on surveys of young people themselves. Several of them national surveys. Typically, they're done in telephone interviews or in self-administered school samples, where they're questionnaires that young people fill out. And although some of these studies have defects in terms of the exact categories of things that they're covering, but the important thing is that they're asking about the same thing in the same way at different time periods, so that you can see how the trends go. The fact that things are going down doesn't mean that they're not high, and the fact that things are going down doesn't mean that everything that's occurring is getting reported. So you could still be seeing lots and lots of cases. But I'm persuaded by the fact that you have this information from both victim surveys and the agency data over relatively long periods of time from very large data sets that do seem to converge in the message that they're giving to us.
Thank you. Questions? Questions? Question? Lori?
Thank you. Should I just speak? Yeah, you can also come down to these mics. If you have questions, you can certainly line up or wait for Karen to come see you.
Thank you so much. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the common characteristics of folks who do end up sexually abusing children. I mean, you talked about men, women, et cetera, in the school setting, but are most abusers people who have been abused themselves? Anything like that?
I guess I would say that the most challenging thing about answering the question is the heterogeneity or the diversity of offenders. So what's easiest to say is what offenders aren't. So David had mentioned about stranger danger. We spent a lot of years focusing on stranger danger. We expect that accounts for probably 10% or less of who offenders are. Other than that, I mean, we know that they're known to their victims. We know that there's a large proportion that are extended family members. But they're male, they're female, they're older, they're younger, they're teens, they're peers. So it's really hard to say that there's a particular characteristic. And I think in some ways that's the challenge of trying to educate, especially children and teens, but even of educating parents. Because we usually like to focus on somebody in a raincoat or someone driving up with a car. And what we should really be focusing on is looking for patterns of behavior. So some of the things that you had mentioned as part of your talk with the modus operandi or patterns of behavior that go on in the school are also the kinds of things we see in the community. So giving gifts, special privileges, going ahead and with teenagers, use of substances and alcohol that's then used as leverage. Seeing in organizational settings who are the favorites sometimes. And again, it's difficult because some of those people truly do have favorites. Some of those people truly are the teacher of the year. But then again, that's also a place where I think we could do a second look. So I would encourage us to think more about the patterns of behavior that we look for that should be red flags rather than who are the people. Because I think we often make mistakes when we get pictures of who offenders are in our mind, and oftentimes it's not who we think about as the characteristic offender who actually goes ahead and offends.
Great. Good answer. Thank you, Dr. Kaufman. How'd that fit, Lori? It's okay. How about one more question? Gentleman in the second row here.
The area of prevention, Dr. Kaufman, is there anything that's being done to prevent the offender from acting out?
Now, I think there's a number of ways to answer that. There are actually some really wonderful initiatives, and I think that it was mentioned at the beginning that we've become much more thoughtful about what are things that we can do to reduce risks that we believe are associated with people perhaps engaging in either risky, inappropriate, or offending behavior. So on one end of the continuum with prevention, we're trying more and more to focus on offering good skills to males in particular, making sure that we're focusing on healthy relationships, healthy sexual behavior to prevent people from engaging in offending behavior. If you're talking about the other end of the continuum, in terms of people who have been once identified as an offender,
No, not
Okay.
those. Those, I'm thinking about that there may be there's a lot of people out there that perhaps have that tendency, and perhaps they're embarrassed, but if they know that there is a service somewhere to go and get some help, I think, prevent the problem even before it starts. That's what I'm talking about.
Sure, and there are programs like Stop It Now, for example, that's a national and international program that is specifically designed around trying to get information out to people who might recognize in themselves a proclivity to be attracted to children in a sexual way, and they work to try to make contact with those folks in a safe way. And when I say safe, because one of the issues about getting people to call in is people won't call in if they believe that that's going to lead to some sort of legal intervention. So they're assigned a number so they can have continuity. They call in, they can get counseling, and they're referred and encouraged to get some more substantial help from a therapist, for example, to try to work through those issues to prevent them from actually going on to offend. So that's one of a couple different programs that exist around the country that try to focus on folks who are in that position and try to keep them from offending. Good question.
That's a really good question. Thank you very much.